Maybe on cartoons I would like to see more sadness. Because it's always happy, it's never sad. So I want sad in it, so I know what sad is.
Good afternoon, everybody. Here is some of the news of the past 12 months. 130 people have been killed in a series of terrorist attacks in Paris. 3 bombings in Brussels have killed 32 people. 49 people have been shot dead by a gunman in a nightclub in Florida. And near her home, a woman MP, the mother of 2 young children, has died after being stabbed and shot in her constituency in Yorkshire. What indeed to tell the children? Is the media specifically aimed at children under 12, telling and showing them too much or too little of the world we all live in? Or are they getting it about right? Are events being explained well enough to that age group? And what is the role of news media specifically for children, especially in a digital world where online content for children is sitting alongside content for adults? These are just some of the questions we want to try and examine in the next hour. My own background is that for over 30 years I was a TV news producer and editor, bringing all sorts of dreadful news to viewers and listeners. Then for 3 years I was the Ofcom content regulator responsible for enforcing the standards code, which attempts after transmission to decide what was right and wrong to transmit. I also had in that role responsibility for digital media literacy strategies that might help the young and the old to navigate their way through the digital world. Now, our format this afternoon is that we're going to use the Paris attacks of November the 13th, 2015 as a case study. We're going to look at how it was covered by the mainstream media and compare it with 2 news services, one French, one British, which are aimed specifically at children under 12. I'll then interview our panel about the lessons of Paris, open it up for other news events and indeed other issues which arise with them and, of course, with you, the audience. Just to introduce the panel, Sophie Gindensberger was one of the founders of Le Petit Libe, which is produced online by the French newspaper Libération for children aged 7 to 12. She is now a freelance journalist specialising in web media. Lewis James is editor of BBC Newsround on CBBC TV and online, which of course is aimed at a similar audience but in Britain. Anne Perkins is a former TV news reporter, now a leader writer and columnist at The Guardian, who wrote about the coverage of the attacks in terms of the coverage for children in The Guardian. All 3 are working journalists. They've all had a very busy time recently. We're very grateful for them to come to Sheffield for this session. And Professor Tom Billington has come not quite so far from the University of Sheffield, where he's an educational and child psychologist. Well, first let's go back as we set the scene to the events of November last year and look first, before we look at the coverage for children, let's look at what we were seeing, the adults amongst us, in mainstream TV. If you remember, the attacks began on a Friday evening and much of the footage appeared first on a Saturday. Now here is a short extract from a report by James Mates of ITV News.
Music in the Bataclan nightclub had long stopped. Instead, the soundtrack to a Friday night in Paris had become the murderous gunfire of 7 heavily armed psychopaths.
Now, inevitably, after this shooting, particularly at the Bataclan, Paris was a very frightened city throughout that weekend, and that's demonstrated in this report by Tom Bradby, also of ITV News.
That a gunman might still be on the loose somewhere, it didn't take much to create whole-scale panic. This was the Place de la République, just after 6 p.m. The rumour spread like lightning that a gunman was approaching. We were filming about 100 yards away at the time. I was asking some young Parisians about the impact of this tragedy when the panic outside triggered chaos inside too.
You say you don't want to be scared. Is the reality you will think twice next time you're going out on a Friday or a Saturday night?
I don't think so, honestly, because like, how can you tell this is going to happen this day or tomorrow? You cannot know, so it's better not to think about it because you cannot do anything about it. So.
Of course, nobody knew what was happening, but most assumed the worst. This woman with her dog was 90 and could not easily move. All anyone could think of was how to get out.
So that was what was on in evening on ITV, and very similar coverage on BBC and Sky and other news outlets. Let's now turn to the coverage by BBC Newsround. And if we've just grabbed a couple of pages, well, actually Newsround have kindly grabbed these from their pages on the day. We'll come into the details in a second, just in a sense to get the scale of the coverage, a whole series of offerings there about the tributes that were going on around the world. That's the Sydney Opera House being lit up. We've got political tributes from David Cameron. And we've got some of the things that were going on in Paris on the Monday on the minute silence. But we particularly wanted to focus on the first video transmitted on CBC by the Newsround team. This is 11:35 on the Saturday morning. Let's look at that report now.
Hi, I'm Aisha. Today on Newsround, we'll be talking about some sad news from the country of France. This morning to sad news from Paris, the capital city of France, after attacks there last night. Jenny's been following all the news.
London, New York in the US, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Just some of the cities around the world turning big buildings red, white and blue, the colours of the French flag, to show people in Paris that they care. It's happening because of attacks in the French capital city that started just after 9 p.m. last night. Sadly, over 100 people have died. The French President, Francois Hollande, has been reassuring his people.
These terrorists that are capable of such atrocities need to know that they will be confronted by a France that is determined, unified and pulled together.
Our Prime Minister, David Cameron, said he's shocked, that his thoughts and prayers are with the French people and that we will do whatever we can to help. Other world leaders, including US President Barack Obama, have shown their support too.
We stand prepared and ready to provide whatever assistance that the government and the people of France need to respond. France is our oldest ally. The French people have stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States time and again. And we want to be very clear that we stand together with them in the fight against terrorism and extremism.
The streets of Paris are quiet today. The police and the army continue to work hard to help keep people safe.
Well, Jenny is with me now. So do we know yet who might have carried out these attacks?
Well, Aisha, we've just heard that a radical Islamist group who call themselves Islamic State say they carried out the attacks. Now, French President Francois Hollande also thinks that they are responsible. We have lots of information about this group, who they are, where they came from, and why some people might want to join on our website.
Now, we've all seen today this news and people might be really upset about this. What should you do if you feel upset by what you've seen?
Well, Aisha, it's natural to feel upset about stories like this. And remember that events like this are very rare. That's why they're on the news. The important thing to do, if you're upset, is to talk to an adult, mum, dad, perhaps a teacher. And remember that there is lots more on our website.
Thank you very much for that, Jenny. And as we said, there's more information about what's happened in Paris on the Newsround website on our live page, which we'll be updating throughout the day. And that's also where you can find our advice if you do feel upset by what has happened.
Now, finally, in this part of the session, we want to show you actually some online pages from Le Petit Libe website. Now, it was in English as well as in French, so we're obviously going to show the English bit. There's the head of the section, and I know you can't pick up the text that size, so let's just grab a couple of pages. I think it's worth just looking at the way it was expressed here. You probably heard that last Friday evening something really bad happened. Le Petit Libe is giving you some information to try to understand what happened, but don't hesitate to ask your parents if you're not sure you understand everything. So quite similar in that sense to the kind of thing that was being said. Now, there was a page here called What Happened on Friday Night. It's quite interesting how specific this is about what happened. So some very violent men called terrorists set up an attack against Paris, the capital city of France, and a nearby town, Saint-Denis, to impose their vision of the world on everybody. They act violently, harming people to scare them. And then at the top of the next page, you see it describes the number of bombs, it describes how people were killed, that the terrorists triggered bombs, and it actually has, in the second paragraph there, in all the terrorists killed at least 129 people. So really quite a lot of detail there. And then there's a page as to why the terrorists would attack. And it has, again, terrorists can have different goals. Some want to take for themselves part of a country where other people live. Others want everyone to follow their religion and share their ideas. And there is a map showing the Islamic State. Not sure the Islamic State claim all that territory, but I think it's simplified for the benefit. So I think you've got a range of coverage there. And to discuss the issues which arise from that, let's start with Sophie. Sophie, I suppose the first thing to say is tell us how that came about, those pages. Did that format exist already? Did you make it up specially?
The format existed already. We had created it 2 months before with 3 colleagues in the newsroom of Libération. We decided to make a web edition for children from 7 to 12, and we really wanted it to be web first and to be something you can touch and click on it and play maybe with it, because in normal edition we had a quiz with questions, and we wanted it to be on very serious questions. Libération has a strong approach of social issues and is a left-wing newspaper, and we wanted it to be not about only about children, but really about questions the same as adults, but aimed at children. So we had an edition. The first one was about refugee crisis, and the second about climate talks, but not only like you can see the bear and the Arctic, and it was really about what are people doing in a summit where they are speaking about climate, etc. And we had another edition in preparation when the attacks occurred, and we decided that we had to do an unscheduled edition about the Paris attacks. So it was for us a side project. We didn't do it full time. So I was at that time I was a social media editor, and I worked at the news desk for the website of Libération. And on the Friday night, there was a big party at Libération. All the newsroom was there with family and friends, and we began to see that there was something went bad, and we didn't understand exactly why at first. And we went live maybe just after the first attacks, because we saw on Twitter that something was occurring there, and I had to do this job first and understanding what was occurring, what those shootings were, and I also did that on the Saturday. But then on the Sunday we thought about Petit Libe, and we thought we had to do something for children. So with 2 colleagues we wrote it, and this time we asked 2 child psychiatrists to read it and to help us find the good tone and what to say, and they asked us to be more precise, and we didn't put the word Bataclan. It's a concert hall that was attacked, and they said we had to, because children listened a lot and they heard things they didn't understand, and if they heard Bataclan and they didn't know what it was, they would imagine it was worse than it was.
Right. So the reason behind the precision was, in a sense, to calm fears rather than obviously you didn't want to create fear.
Yes, it was.
And what was the reaction from people who were using the site? Children and parents.
The reactions were really good, because people needed something simple, and we tried to tell the truth and to tell that we didn't know if it could happen again, but we tried to tell it in a comforting way, telling that the police were there to protect them, and telling that they could be together and that they could do things like lighting candles and smile to other people in the street. And I think that the parents needed that too, and I needed that too, to find something positive to say, and it was soothing in a certain way, and not only speaking about the attacks and what was so horrible.
Did people say that you gave too much detail, too little detail? I mean, that you got it right?
Nobody told us that we gave too much detail, but I think we really imagined this edition more than the other as to be reading parents with children together, and maybe not the children alone. That's why we really precise on the beginning that the children should tell their parents if there are some things they don't understand. But the emails we got were all really enthusiastic, so we didn't have reproach about that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Lewis, cast your mind back to that weekend. What did you see the role of Newsround on that weekend?
I think my initial reaction, if I can go through the evening in the same way that Sophie did, was horror what happened, and I think fairly quickly I reached the conclusion this probably wasn't something we could wait to cover. I think there's always a dilemma when you're doing news for children, which is should you wait until you've got some certainty about who's carried out the attack? Because what children crave, I think, is answers to questions. And I think the scale of these attacks, the fact that they were in close proximity to the UK, in Paris, the fact that sporting venues were attacked, the fact that I think the coverage was going to be on a huge scale across the rest of the media, all those factors led me quite quickly to conclude that we had to do this straight away. Right, just explain, what would you normally do at a weekend compared to... Oh, I mean our shows at weekends are usually quite magazine. Right. So it was a conscious effort that you needed to do more than you would normally do, and I think to go and to cover it straight away as well. Right. I think with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we weighted one bulletin, and then we managed to put together an animated VT for the Charlie Hebdo attacks, because the images were probably even more problematic for the Charlie Hebdo attacks than they were for Paris. So we actually told the story about an attack on freedom of speech via a cartoon, which is quite apt given it was Charlie Hebdo. Here we didn't really have that option. We just had to. I felt that morning, and so did the team, that we just had to go with this. Right. And so. Luckily we had those images of the buildings, because I think that's probably the most problematic thing for children, is to convey the information that they need, that they crave, the answers to the questions that they want, without frightening them with images of dark shapes and dark shadows and explosions, because they don't add any context to a child's understanding. They're just frightening, I think, for children. So you're trying to help them to understand. What are you trying to avoid doing? Are you trying to avoid? You're obviously trying to avoid frightening them unnecessarily. I think you're trying to avoid frightening them unnecessarily. I think you're trying to. I think what Sophie said is completely right. You're trying to tell them the truth. I mean, quite early on in our coverage and the reaction we were getting from children through our website, it was quite clear that the biggest question we were being asked was, will this happen in the UK? That was the number one question, and we were able to answer that. We enlisted the help of our colleague Frank Gardner, the BBC security correspondent, who's brilliant at talking to children, and he said very directly to children, not only is it possible there'll be an attack in the UK, it's quite likely at some point there will be an attack, but the important thing to remember is it's highly unlikely to happen to you, your family, or anyone you know. And I think being able to tell the truth to children directly, but also to give them that reassurance, that's the real measure of success, I think, is in terms of trying to convey difficult events to children. And since Paris, have been a whole series of other episodes which I read out. Has anything changed in your thinking as these things have developed? Have you moved in any particular direction? Are they the same kind of stories, or are they always a bit different? They're always a bit different. I mean, personally, I found the murder of Joe Cox more challenging than the Paris attacks. I think it was an incredibly complex story. I think because there were also legal considerations in that with a man being arrested, which made it very difficult to give children those certain facts that they needed. So that was a very difficult and different challenge to Paris. What I would say, I think probably I think it was from the response we got from children via our website. The thing that struck me really was I think it reinforced how children relate events very closely to their own lives, and to that method of reassurance that I think Frank Gardner gave was I think tremendously useful, and it's something we repeated again in the Brussels attacks. That idea of, you know, we can't promise this won't happen to you. We can't promise this won't happen in the UK. We can't promise it'll happen, you know, in somewhere that you know, but it's highly unlikely to happen to you or your family or anyone you know. And I think that formulation, that we worked out during the Paris coverage, I think that worked. And I think just reinforce some of the things, you know, that we've always done in the newsround, but hearing from children directly, you know, it was great to hear from children in Paris. We sent a reporter to Paris on the Sunday, was on the ground and was talking to children and their families, and there was just a lovely moment and a quite revealing moment, I think, for our audience, where a young girl was asking her mother, "Is everything going to be okay?" And the mother just hugged her and said, "I hope so, I hope so." And I thought, again, echoing what Sophie said, you know, I think it's that ability to tell the truth. That's the most important thing we can do for children, in my opinion, is tell them the truth, but to do it in a way that makes them feel safe, and that they don't have, you know, a huge number of spiraling questions coming out of the coverage. But it was a challenge. I mean, you know, it was an ongoing, evolving process during the week after the attacks. You know, it's often said that news is the first draft of history. Well, that was the first draft of the first draft, if you like. So, yeah, I mean, I think we reflect a lot on it. But I'm very proud of the coverage that we did that week.
Okay. Let's move on to Anne, and taking that point about, look, these were all done at slightly different times. Some was on a Saturday, some was done on a Monday. And you did write a piece in which you contrasted the newsround coverage, and I think it was probably that piece we showed with a sound problem. And you wrote, you compared it with Le Petit Libe, and you said, "So be accepting of fear, we all have to live with it." I mean, reflecting now on, again, using these just a few samples, what is your feeling about, is there a difference in this approach or not?
I was very informed when I wrote that piece by the fact that, and it's fitting today, is that today is the anniversary of 7/7, because that day in 2005, I had just gone back to work, having been off, and my kids, who were 12 and 13, I think, were with friends, and I came into London, central London, and there was chaos, and I couldn't get on the phone. I finally managed to ring the mother that my children were with and say, "Don't tell them anything, but, you know, I am fine. If they ask, tell them I'm fine." And later I discovered that actually they did know something awful had happened, and they were in a complete panic, but they kind of didn't dare to ask. And that very much made me think that the more facts you can give, obviously in context, then the better it's got to be. And when I saw the news, this was on Monday, when I saw the news beat, which I felt was very unspecific, and then looked at Libe, which I thought I really liked for the level of detail it gave. I can see there's a difference between something that's written and something that's visual. And what I liked about it was the amount of detail, the fact that it emphasised that it's natural to be fearful, and legitimised it. I also very much liked the way they distinguished between terrorism and Islam. I thought that was extremely important and very well done. And then finally, the last point that I think that the Libe pulled together did was to emphasise that it's very unlikely to happen to you. So you kind of have to convey this, both a lot of facts and a sense of the risk. And that was what particularly impressed me with Libe. And I must say, watching more of the newsround coverage, I mean, as you say, Frank Gardner in particular is brilliant at explaining in a very unpatronising way the detail.
But in your piece, you picked up the number of times that newsround said sad. And I suppose that was a sort of metaphor for we're not actually going to tell you too precise what happened, but sad covers it. Is that what you were getting at?
Yes, exactly. I mean, of course, it was sad, but that's not really nearly enough to help a child to understand what's happening. And I would have called it frightening, and I would have called it terrible, as well as sad. You make a lot of the same judgments, don't you, for children that you make in any ordinary news bulletin, I think. I think that that the use of nebulous language is not helpful.
Tom, we'll give a chance perhaps if Lewis wants to respond to what Anne says. I mean, in the broader context here, picking up what Anne says about on 7/7, her children had found out anyway, seems to me we've got here with social, let's add in social media as well, a situation where, you know, I consider myself once the gatekeeper. When there were only two TV channels in Britain that had news, what I decided was pretty much what half the population saw, and if I didn't want them to see, they didn't see it. Well, those days are long gone, but what are children to make of a situation where you've got sort of adult news regulated, you've got sort of children's news regulated, and then you've got what we used to call it at Ofcom the Wild West. Do they understand these different places, these different spaces? Do they have different expectations of what they'll get when they go there, or what?
Yeah, so I work as a teacher and researcher at the university, and so there's a theoretical aspect of what I'd like to say, but I also practice in the family courts, so as a practitioner, where children's accounts of distress are central to the life of the court. So the notion that children are unused to dealing with distress or forms of atrocity is not necessarily the case. Most children have forms of distress even in the normal household, so they deal with it in a particular kind of way. What I think the media is engaged in, when I write something, I have a particular audience, I have a particular, as it were, client in mind. It's the court, or it's an academic audience. I think the problem with media is that they're not quite sure who's going to be on the other end of the screen or whatever. And so government wants to get involved in that, I suppose, and say, well, what kind of notion of childhood do we want to create? What is childhood, in effect? And I guess in a lot of these videos, etc., and that's what we're negotiating. What is childhood? What are the boundaries of childhood? What is it that children should know? And that's a kind of living organism. The notion that actually childhood is something which stays static is not true. We're negotiating it all the time. You know, the limitations to the age at which they should vote, the criminal responsibility, they're all being negotiated by different societies at different times. So you in the media dive into this. Not passively, but creating it. You're part of of constructing how it is the nation constructs the idea of childhood. What I would say in terms of the specific aspects of delivering the bad news or whatever, a tragic news, context, in my view, is virtually everything. Not necessarily all, but virtually everything. We watched the television on the Friday night of the Paris bombings. And like 9/11 or 7/7, people remember where they are forever as adults because they're shocking. So we watched the events unfold on that Friday night with our 14-year-old twins, and we were quite shocked and horrified. 14-year-olds, we can control what's happening. But yeah, could we know with any certainty what was going on? No. Can children live lives without uncertainty? No. Children have to get used to uncertainty. And I think the example you quoted from Frank Gardner there was a very good one. I think Libe was excellent in what it did. I think the piece that you did, did you do something on November the 27th?
Well, we we basically rolled coverage through, so there's from various dates. Yeah.
Well, I think what November 7th had in common with November 27th coverage had in line with your original piece in France was that it invited the person through into a different door, and if they didn't want to go through that door, they didn't have to. It invited them to ask a question. And if you wanted to know the answer to that question, you can go there. So there was some element of which the child could feel some degree of control.
But is that realistic in a digital world where you're only a click away from somewhere where there's not even a door? There's, the door's been opened and somebody's shouting at you through the door.
Absolutely.
I mean, Lewis, do you want to respond to that and to what Anne may have said?
Yeah, I mean, on the clicking on something else and being a click away from any kind of any kind of horrific news from around the world. You think of the worst, the beheading videos and so on, that IS propaganda. I think from our experience, I think some children are exposed to it, some are not at all. I don't know if that's your experience. And I think you have to be aware that you're serving both of those audiences, that some of them will have seen the 6 o'clock news and will have seen those people running over tables and trying to get away, and some won't. And you've got to serve both of those audiences. And what I would say is I agree completely about context, and what an online digital platform allows you to do is to, if I invite the audience afterwards to look at Newsround's Paris page, live page, which is called What Happened in the Paris Attacks, and it's video after video after video, and it's all context. It's all, who are IS, where did they come from, why do they want to do the things they do, what's being done to try and stop them. All those questions that have, and try and build up as much context as possible, which I think sometimes is lost in the main TV bulletins. I think I personally feel that we do a better job in explaining the context than others. I mean, on Anne's point, she's been very polite today, I think. In her article, she said that Newsround coverage was useless, which obviously I strongly disagree with. And I won't speak for our coverage. I'd like our coverage to speak for itself if people want to take a look at it. I'd also say Anne's view is at odds with other journalists and parents and teachers, and our the feedback we got was overwhelmingly positive, and that we were doing a job that no one else was doing.
But Anne will make her own case, but just on the basis of what we showed,
yeah,
you, in that report, you did not have almost any of the detail that Petit Libe had about what actually had happened. I mean, basically your piece was something sad has happened, and here's the context. The missing bit was what had happened.
Well, we said there'd been attacks. We said that people had been killed.
Yeah.
We said who claimed responsibility. Yeah. We linked to the website to say who that group is, what they believe, and how they were doing it. What we didn't say was people were shot and people were bombed. And I think that's the difference between a broadcast medium, I think, and an online medium. I think in terms of somewhere like Petit Libe, which is appointment to view in a way. I think you can go that step further. I think a television broadcast on a Saturday morning, I think it's much harder to start talking about people in a concert hall being executed. And I think that's the difference, I think.
But Lewis, isn't there a midway point, or at least a point slightly closer to what actually happened than you managed to get to there? I recognise all the constraints and the difficulties, but I think if it had seen that, I would simply have been left bewildered, and I would not have felt informed about what had been happening.
I disagree. I think I do fundamentally disagree, and I think what we're able to do at Newsround is to both broadcast on television and to have our online service standing behind that with more context and more opportunity and a chance for children to engage directly with us and to ask questions. I mean, I would stand by the decision made not to talk about executions, not to talk about shootings on the morning.
No, but you wouldn't talk about executions, but you can talk about shootings. Maybe talk a little bit more about the perpetrators.
Well, I invite people to have a look at the website where there's a full guide to IS, their theology, their methodology. It's all there.
Okay, I think other sessions have complained there wasn't enough time for questions from the audience, so let's make sure you have a chance to ask a question. Just keep going to the front row. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hiya. I was wondering if you built in ways to teach kids media literacy specifically around how to read various media sources about these kinds of events, so that when there is a disagreement in how to portray stuff and how many facts to give between various news producers, giving them the tools to interpret that for themselves, in the way that, you know, adults could probably also do with that in case they are not sure how to get facts. And do you also engage adults who might not have enough knowledge to help their kids co-watch and be active viewers? I'm thinking about the Chilcot Report and the film We Are Many, which happens to be out in screens again, and I know a lot of adults who are seeing that so that they can talk to their kids about it.
Yeah, that's really good. If I may, yeah, I think that's a really good example. So we covered the Chilcot Report yesterday, and I think it's it's a prime example of what Newsround is there for, because I watched some of the coverage on news bulletins last night of Chilcot, and they all assumed that, one, you were an adult when the events of 2003 happened and you could remember those events. You knew what weapons of mass destruction were. You knew who Saddam Hussein was. You knew who Tony Blair was. And so, our role there is to help partly, I think, yes, to help parents, teachers, other adults to co-watch and to discuss with their children what's happening, because we don't assume knowledge from our audience. We assume intelligence, but we don't assume knowledge. And most of you will be people who create content for children, and you know the intelligence of your audience, but they don't always have the assumed knowledge.
Okay, let's get a non-media view on this. Tom, do you want to, reflecting here that, digital media literacy, or there are many versions of it, is about understanding the media. Do you, there's been, certainly when I was responsible for it at Ofcom, there were endless debates about it, with no one was ever quite sure what it was. Are we any further ahead in terms of helping people to understand their way through all this?
Controlling children's access to media is getting more and more tricky, isn't it?
But helping them as opposed to controlling.
Yeah. It suggests that actually children always want an adult to be there. I think there is an issue here as to regulated and unregulated spaces, and the extent to which children have to have adults there as a presence making sense of things all the time. I think historically children have had open spaces where they've been able to make sense of the situation and make things up. It seems to me, perhaps with new social media, that those spaces are almost returning. They're recreating spaces where children can go, where adults aren't necessarily surveilling them in those quite the same way, and that makes us quite uneasy as adults, doesn't it?
Yes. Can I just ask, Sophie, is there, in France, is there any difference? Are children taught more about trying to understand the implications of the media, or not?
We didn't do that with the Petit Libe,
but in the French schools or in the schools?
There's an institution called the Clémy. It's a teacher working with a journalist to explain how the press works. And I know someone who works there. And every once time a year, they do a special week about press in school, and journalists go explain their work on how it works. I did it one time with in a high school, so they're that.
Okay, sorry, you wanted to come back? Yeah, you still got the mic, okay? Quickly.
Thanks. So I've been ahead of PSHE, and I think it's safe to assume that we cannot control what kids see, and no matter how uneasy it makes you feel, I think it would be helpful, as someone who's helped young people navigate this with the media resources available, which have been excellent, the sources that you've described, and also viral videos like the little boy and his dad talking right after the Paris bombings. It just went all over. It was subtitled within a couple of hours so that everyone could understand it in English as well. The kids needed media literacy lessons, and they were coming from me. It would be much more helpful and much more sort of a social responsibility kind of thing if you guys built that in too. And I haven't heard that from any of your answers. So it's a request. When you are making the media, make honest ways for kids to interpret bias, see intentions, understand who controls, who pays for, who benefits from what they create. Because adults are trying to share this with each other, and it would be really helpful if we'd learned that when we were kids too.
Okay. Well, in order to get some more questions, a short answer: is it the BBC's job to help people understand the media?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There's a hand over there. Thank you.
Thanks. Amanda Gummer, Fundamentally Children. My background's child development psychology, and I wonder whether we're a bit too binary about children's news, whether we don't recognise the massive difference between, say, a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, and whether we need more sort of scaled or more gradation in the news, and how either the French or the BBC can provide that kind of variation and the sliding scale that satisfies the needs of children of different ages.
That's a really interesting question, because we have talked about this kind of block of 7 till 12, but Anne, as a parent of somebody a little bit older, how do you cope with these gradations between these different ages?
Fortunately, the whole digital media thing, when my kids were that age, was much less of a problem. But I exactly take what you say, and the truth is I don't have a knowledgeable, experienced answer to give. Beyond, obviously, if you talk to your children, you know what they're understanding and you know where they need help. And I think keeping that channel of communication open has to be the most effective thing that at least that a parent can do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, there was, I agree, and in terms of teaching the parents how to, that open communication is absolutely vital. I'm talking more about the responsibility of the broadcasters to provide differentiation between their programming and the sort of the offerings they give to children at different ages.
So you're looking for a kind of early teen news, are you, or what?
Potentially.
Yeah. If I can come on that, yeah, I mean, I agree with you entirely. I mean, it is a real challenge to broadcast, something on this level for 6 to 12-year-olds for television. It is tricky, but it's something we attempt to do. It's something Newshound's done for a very long time. I think the online space offers opportunities here, and I think if you look at our coverage online, what you'll see is there's a lot of video. And that's because, you'll know that at 6, 7, 8, children are very good at navigating their way around video, and they're able to do that. But also there's a lot of text as well. And so for those older children, I think what we're trying to do is online we can go into more detail and serve them a bit better while still serving that younger audience. But I think you're right. I think it's a real challenge, and I think serving sort of 13, 14, 15-year-olds is something that we're thinking about in an online space, and I think it's a completely different ball game from the younger end of the audience, and working out how to do that is going to be very important in the future, I think.
Okay. Anyone else want to add to that at all?
Well, I just wondered if kids in a way don't kind of build their own television newses out of Facebook shares and all the other different kind of online stuff that's available.
I think once they get to 11, 12, 13, I think they start to do that. Yeah, and I think definitely that there's a sea change in the way they consume media at that point.
Okay, take another question. I can see one right at the. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Tedija Klai. I'm a content manager at GetNet, the children's channel of the public broadcaster in Flanders. And I'm also a doctor, a PhD in child psychology. So what I wanted to respond to my colleague psychologist there, at the public broadcaster, we have different brands for different populations and target groups. So I think we will always, for example, GetNet is 0 to 12, and within GetNet you have GetNet Junior. It's similar to CBBS and CBBC. And we have the task to give the news to the children from 6 to 12 years old. But we are not alone. It's not only our responsibility as a public broadcaster. We, at that moment, when such thing happens, we have to work together with all the other partners that work with children, with the schools, with youth, with parents, and so on. And then you can make the news individual to each child and to the different target levels and to the different, because okay, a child of 6-year-old is not one of 12, but for example, one 10-year-old is not the same as the other 10-year-old. So what I think it's then important is such a situation to work together and not only do your own responsibility, but it is also our responsibility to work together with all the partners in the development of children. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you suggesting that there ought to be, a different brand for this age group that we're talking about now, these sort of 11 to 14 to 15? I mean, for instance, would you use the Newsround brand if you were doing such an online service, or would you have to create a new brand? Not that it would be that difficult.
Well, it'll surprise you that my position, the editor of Newsround, I quite like the Newsround brand to be to be that brand,
even for an adult news site.
I actually think that the branding is less important. I think traditionally this has been seen as a branding issue by media outlets, that serving that kind of teen demographic is all about, branding and making it cool or having a different name for it. I think, Anne alluded to it, but the way that teenagers share content, they almost don't care where it comes from. They almost don't notice. I mean, I find it a challenge sometimes to get them to notice it's our content when we are sharing on BBC News's Facebook page, because people don't care where the content comes from. And so I don't think it's a branding issue. I think it's about content. It's about, are you making the right content for them? And what I would say is that we know from schools that older children do watch Newsround, and the age at which they switch off depends on the child, like you said. I mean, for some children, I think if they're 14, Newsround doesn't appeal to them, and they want to watch the 10 o'clock news, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing for some 14-year-olds, and it's not for others, and they still want to gravitate towards Newsround. So it depends.
Let's take one for the audience, and I want to introduce a secondary theme, but let's take that one. Person at the back, please.
Hi, Kath Shackleton from Fettle Animation. Hello, Louise.
Hello there.
Just finished a piece of work for Newsround. We've animated a story of a young child refugee. I wondered, Louise, if you could give a wider perspective on the role of animation and what it brings to news coverage and how it helps explain difficult things to kids.
Again, looks like you, Lewis.
That wasn't a planted question, by the way. Yeah.
And how much money in the BBC budget would you need to do it better?
Animation is extremely important. I wrote a blog last year for the BBC about the role of animation, in particular in telling some of these stories, and it helps enormously in that difficult thing of what imagery you can use in telling these stories. And animation allows you to not just pick from news agencies and from from other sources. In that particular example that Kath has, that I've been working on with Kath, the story of unaccompanied child refugees is an incredibly important one. It's an incredibly important political issue at the moment. I think it's very important to inform our audience about this issue, but it's very difficult to interview an unaccompanied child refugee because they are wards of the state. So what we've done in this animation, is animated the story to give anonymity to that particular person, and working with children's services at Kent County Council, we've been able to protect that child whilst being able to bring to a wider audience the story of unaccompanied child refugees, which is an important one. And so that's one concrete example of what animation can allow you to do.
Tom, I guess in your work you're using sometimes different techniques. Any thoughts you have on the use of animation, or indeed any other techniques to try to bring some of these issues to a younger audience?
Yeah, again, I'd come back to context. If we're looking, say, at the 6 to 12-year-old age, it's the kind of the immediate experience of the context in which they're accessing it. And children watch adults. And if the adults are there, they will be working out the adult reaction as part of their own response. Could I just go back to a comment from the I think, the original footage very early on, in which the terrorists were described as psychopaths. That sort of leaves me a bit uneasy, because there would be it's certainly horrific actions, clearly, but I'm not too sure that that's necessarily helpful. It's a helpful description, because the decisions to wreak havoc or whatever presumably were taken in a kind of rational frame of mind. The rationality may well have been different to ours, but it has had a reasoning behind it. And I think a term like psychopath prevents us thinking about the issues involved with this.
Okay, thank you. I just want to develop it now into something a little bit different, because all the news stories we talk about so far are things that all right-minded people would condemn. Okay, let's take an issue in which families might be divided, towns might be divided. I mean, the one that comes to mind most obviously is Brexit. I mean, obviously, Lewis, your job is to explain the issues and everything, but are there different dynamics at work here, aren't there, within British life? Again, Anne, do you have any thoughts on that? And I mean, goodness knows, I suppose you've written about it often enough. What did children make of Brexit? Should they be? I mean, for those whose parents were voted Remain, should they be fearful? I mean, how do you reassure them?
Well, I can tell you, my young 20s are absolutely furious with their parents' generation. But the wider question about how you report it. I mean, one of the things that's most infuriating for the kids who did vote is the number of kids who didn't vote. And one of the interesting things is, how did we fail to get across to this demographic the urgency of them A, registering, and B, getting out of bed or organising a postal ballot and taking part in this vote. I feel that's a real fail from us all. Okay, we're talking about somebody outside your normal age range, but goodness, we've it's a colossal example of how we have not caught up with the way that demographic consumes media and media messages.
I mean, Anne, you and I worked on Channel 4 News, I think, during the miners' strike, if I remember right, which was a pretty big story here in Sheffield, and which, I remember we did a film in a place called Shirebrook, which is now best known as the home of Sports Direct, but actually was a village where virtually one half of the village was not speaking to another half of the village. And I just feel that there's a level here, a level of argument which goes beyond what we've been talking about in terms of, I say we can all condemn terrorist acts, but I don't know, again, are there equivalents in France of issues which run so deep in society that you wouldn't quite know what to tell the children? I mean, is racism in France, for instance, I mean, is that an undercurrent which you've ever attempted to address on some of the web pages you worked on?
No, we didn't, but it's easy to explain racism. It's not there's not a fracture. Maybe there was this sort of fracture during the constitution referendum too. But I didn't write for children at that time. Right. But I think it was also a big in newsrooms. It was really in Libération. People didn't agree with another, so it was really difficult. So I thought in the families it was also a big thing. But today I can find something really a gap between people.
Lewis, any reflections on the Brexit debate and Anne's point about young voters?
I think, I think it's very true. I think I think it reflects badly on us all that 18 to 24-year-olds didn't vote. Although interestingly, if the level of 18 to 24-year-olds voting was the same as over 50s, and all those extra 18 to 24-year-olds had voted Remain, it still wouldn't have been a Remain vote. So I think we need to put a little bit of context into it. It wasn't the 18 to 24s what lost it. I think it's quite important to reflect on that. For us, I mean, it's I think it's you're right. It's you know, everyone condemned terrorism. The fact is, in a binary vote like a referendum is, you know, virtually half of people are very disappointed, and just over half are absolutely delighted with the decision, presumably, that they made, or most of them will still be delighted with it. So it's just making sure that we reflect that. I mean, I think one issue where you can really explore those fault lines is over immigration, and we've spoken to children directly about immigration in the run-up to the Brexit vote, and you know, we went to Southampton, which is an area that's seen lots of EU immigration, and you see the whole range of views, you know, in children, the same as adults, from you know, very pro-immigration, from children who are Polish themselves, right through to children who are worried about how busy their school is, and relate that to immigration. So, you know, it's very similar to adults in that way.
There's one interesting point that came out of the post-mortem on the Brexit referendum, which is the attitude to experts and to where you get facts from. And that strikes me as having an interesting read across to the way we deliver news to kids from an early age. Where does this deep scepticism about official or expert knowledge come from? Where does it kind of start taking effect, I wonder?
Tom, do you have a view on
Well,
that?
I suppose if news rounds pitched at 6 to 12, I mean, from a psychological point of view, in a Piagetian sense, that's the age at which a child would come to want to know something about that external authority, and so children become little politicians at that age, and it's right that we do play some of these issues out in the media so that they get some sense of it. I would say a colleague reflected on the Brexit, and they have a young child, and there was a total mismatch between what appeared to be the content on the screen, which was adults talking, and the shock and the horror on their parents' faces, which was quite tricky to make sense of for the child. And so if there is that mismatch, then a child becomes really engaged at that moment, trying to make sense of their own adults' responses and what's on the screen.
Yeah, good point. Have you got time for one more question, if there is one? Yes, just one. Let's take that one, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Hi, Julie Fox from AWOL Animation in Paris. It's not a question, it's just a comment, because I saw how several families around me, children in France, reacted at that time. They don't have news for different age groups in Paris. So the children that I know around me, they saw the news that the adults saw, and they saw it at the same time. And the adults I know, the children reacted and said, you know, straight out, is this war? And the parents said yes.
Yeah.
That was my experience of living through that time in France.
Interesting point. So, do you want to, so for those people who weren't looking at your web pages in French or in English, there is no equivalent of Newsround. Is that what you're saying?
No, there's not.
Right.
No.
So, and you're saying the conclusion they drew from that. Well, I mean, the president of France did say it was war, didn't he? I think. So presumably they believe the experts.
Yes. They did say that. So yes, and a lot of people, when a big thing like that occurs, they watch BFM. It's a news channel. Yeah. And I think when the television is on and all the children can see it. But I think that's why the Petit Libe is something to come after they saw maybe images they shouldn't have, because you can really explain, and there are no videos in our webpage. Yeah. It's only text, and it's thought as a moment to reflect on what happened and what they saw before, I think.
Okay. Well, let's take that as a further vote of confidence in Newsround, Lewis. We'll come to close our session now. Thank you very much, and please thank our panel.